This is actually a session on global political economy, and I see Radhika giving me the looks for not saying geopolitical economy. This is what it's all about, and you don't look at me, you look at that guy because he's selling the books. We are good socialists, we are all in favor of buying books, right? Keeping the economy afloat. And being an economist, I'm pleased about this turnout. Often when you talk about these kind of questions, when it's about multiple identities, you name it, you have a full room. When it's about economics, not many people show up. Thank you, capitalist crisis, that the interest in political economy, geopolitical economy is on the rise again. And this session obviously talks about Radhika's book, Geopolitical Economy. And it's one kind of, in a two-part series. We have another one talking about a different book. I don't know whether that will be for sale. I have my mobile library with me, as you can see. And that's the one by Leo Panelists and Sam Ginnan, The Making of Global Capitalism. And those of you who already read Radhika's book will know she doesn't like that at all. The notion of global capitalism is one that she strongly disagrees with. I know one of our speakers sitting dangerously close to Radhika will try to make the case that there is such a thing as global capitalism. So we have an interest in these issues, and we have lots of different points of views. I thought I'd like to connect these two sessions. We wanted to have them back to back, which didn't turn out for practical reasons, but they're really closely connected, and I assume many of those that are here right now will also come to the session on Leo's and Sam's book. And I'm also chairing that session, and so I had to read them both. What struck me was that they have lots of similarities. Both focus heavily on capitalism, world capitalism in the 20th century, drawing a little bit on the 19th century. Both focusing heavily on the United States of America and a little bit on Britain. Both make the argument that all the globalization talk saying that the state is obsolete is nonsense, arguing strongly that states play a role. But the conclusions these three authors draw couldn't be more different. Where Radhika says, actually, the US was never in a hegemonic position in the first place. It's all an illusion. The only true hegemon that ever existed was Britain. Ginnan and Panich arrive at the opposite conclusion, saying it took the Americans actually almost the entire 20th century to arrive at where they wanted to be since Wilson announced his 14 points. So there's obviously quite a range of different interpretations, which promises to give us an interesting discussion. And to kick off the discussion, I want to say that despite the different conclusions, I found the same pieces missing in both books. And those pieces actually are, there's a little bit about the Cold War in both of them, but it's really just sporadically mentioned. And somebody who grew up right on the border of the Iron Curtain, I had American GIs in my hometown and could see Red Army troops just across the border. I found that quite striking. And also a number of really key class struggles, namely the Chinese Revolution, and the events that led to the Cold War in the first place, the rise of fascism in Europe and the alliance with Japan. I found them kind of strikingly missing and thought, whichever point you make, whether you argue there is global hegemony of the United States or that it's just an illusion, in both cases I think the argument would have been stronger if other states than the United States would also have been incorporated. And with that I used up my speaking time and put on now the moderator's hat. You see we have quite a lineup. We have Bill Carroll from UVic. He's kind of our true host, I suppose. We have Radhika, who is obviously the reason we are meeting here, so thanks for helping us with that. We have Paul Kellogg, who's a colleague of mine at Athabasca University. We have Sabah Alnaseri, who is kind of an old friend of mine from way back in Germany, and we know both in Canada. And we have Steve McBride, who has to explain why he left beautiful British Columbia from Ontario, if he has time to do so. All speakers have 5 minutes because there are so many. The idea was that each of the reviewers will give a very, and when I say 5 minutes, I mean 5 minutes, give one argument, what they found the most striking about the book. We do this one round, then Radhika will respond to that, and after that we will open it up to discussion amongst ourselves, but also including you. And I see lots of things on Paul's list there. You will have a chance to inject it in later rounds, but we really don't want 5 long speeches, especially not after lunch. And Sabah asked me to be the last because he arrived last. So if it's fine with you, Bill, we just move from left to right, or however you want to see that.
Left always better than right.
Okay. Well, it's this book is a really interesting contrarian analysis, is what I would describe it, of ambitiously wide scope. Radhika positions herself against a whole range of perspectives: liberal, Marxist, anarchist. She takes up central questions in the development of capitalism from the 19th century through to the contemporary conjuncture. So it's really quite a sweeping analysis and a very interesting read. I'll just make a few points. I have very limited time. Throughout, there's a very sympathetic account of Keynes. And I think that, I would say that Radhika probably overemphasizes his radicalism, is one point I would make. I tend to prefer Kees van der Pijl's analysis that Keynes really presents a hegemonic strategy for managing capitalism from the productive capital concept of control. And he doesn't point to socialist revolution, but to a kind of technocratic project of management, accentuating the need to prevent crises of underconsumption, but tending to underestimate the equally systemic dynamic that leads to overinvestment and overproduction of capital. And I think, this is also underplayed by Radhika. It's perhaps a theoretical quibble, but for both of them, there's a tendency to mistake the visible symptom of overaccumulation, namely problems in realizing surplus value, underconsumption, for what is, in a sense, a deep cause of the crisis. And of course, underconsumption is rooted in class relations, and it is an aspect of capitalist crisis, but it's not so much the driving force in the way that overaccumulation is. So I think an overaccumulation crisis dynamic, if worked into this basic analysis, could actually improve it, particularly on issues of financialization, bubble economies, and so on, as prime instances of overaccumulation. Particularly overaccumulation of fictitious capital, as the credit system effectively displaces the crisis into the future, but ultimately deepens it when it arrives. This is, of course, a basic analysis that we find in Volume 3 of Capital. And David Harvey is a contemporary exponent of this analysis. But I think it helps illuminate problems of financialization and crisis in contemporary capitalism. So that would be one point I would make. In terms of specific questions, given that I only have 5 minutes, let me bring in Panich and Ginden. Radhika's central thesis in the book is this novel view of the United States as a failed hegemon, a hegemon whose attempts to follow in the footsteps of the British Empire were doomed from the start, and she explains very clearly why that is the case. I don't have time to go into it. But all of this as a thesis is diametrically opposed to Panich and Ginden, as Ingo has already stated. And I guess they present what Radhika would call a variant of hegemonic stability theory. Let me just take up Panich and Ginden's case on one key issue, dollar hegemony, which is very important to them. in their analysis of global capitalism and American empire. Radhika sees this as always tenuous, always and increasingly impossible in a multipolar world. She sees the 2008 Great Recession as marking a definitive end of an already weak dollar hegemony. Yet for Panich and Ginden, the 2008 crisis portends nothing of the sort. It's Europe that suffers the worst crisis because of its defective political-economic architecture and so on. This further cements American hegemony from their perspective. Actual figures show that as a reserve currency, the dollar's position has dropped only slightly from 64% of global currency reserves in 2007 and 2008 to 62% in each of the last 4 years. Meanwhile, the euro crisis has, in fact, seen a drop of the euro's share. If we take this as, one kind of measure, right? Who knows? How do you? And that, in fact, is my question. There's many ways of talking about dollar hegemony and trying to get a hold of what we mean by that. After all, we look at China, and China is busy creating these bilateral currency sway agreements with a host of countries that don't even use the U.S. dollar. So that's a sign of, dollar hegemony in crisis, looming crisis. While it's continuing to buy and hold T-bills and so on. So it's walking away from the dollar as a medium of exchange. It's still investing in dollars and holding those investments in T-bills. So the situation is murky, I would say. And I guess the question would be, how do we discern the end of dollar hegemony, if it's in sight? What do we mean by that? How am I doing for time? Do I have one more point that I can make?
We have 2 more minutes?
2 more minutes, wow. Okay. I think among the book's strengths is its analysis of the contradictions of U.S. militarism, which is largely missing from Panich and Ginden. A crucial aspect of its hegemony. It's pretty clear that the Paul Kennedy thesis of imperial overreach applies quite exactly to the Bush Jr. regime. I think, maybe knew that from the start. But the Obama administration, in my view, has not so much turned away from the military assertion of U.S. power as opted for drones and the like, and lower costs of American lives and so on. But, even if international criminal law is thrown to the dogs and so on and so forth. So I guess the question here very quickly would be, how does the Obama administration on the military front fit into the picture of geopolitical economy that Radhika is developing here? Then the final point I'll make is the book has an upbeat conclusion that seems to offer up the BRICS and other rising stars of capitalism's former periphery or semi-periphery as key players in the shift, to quote Radhika, in the world's economic center of gravity away from the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, the triad. But there is a sense in which the BRICS might be playing a sub-imperialist role, not inconsistent with continued dominance by the triad. And I wonder, just to pose that question, how would you respond to that as a thesis, that it's not so much a major shift in center of gravity, but the BRICS taking on a sub-imperialist role? This is Patrick Bond's analysis, for example. And so I'll leave it at that because I'm out of time.
That was just in time, perfect. Paul goes next.
See, I'm absolutely sure from my emails, Ingo, that you said 5 hours each. But anyway, that's okay. I'll reduce it to 5 minutes.
You thought you were going to Havana and doing the Fidel.
So, I had to throw out my Castro notes, but I'll just stick with the summary. I'll start where Bill ended with the issue of the BRICS, because for that alone, there's many reasons I like Radhika's book, but for that alone, I think it's really worth its weight. Because we've got a problem in left political economy. In my opinion, the most significant industrial revolutions in the history of the world are happening right now. They're happening right now in this world that we live in, and they're happening not in Europe. And because they're not happening in Europe, we tend not to notice them. But they're big, and they're real. The transfer of population from the countryside to the city that's gone on in China already is on the order of 500 million people in the last 15, 16 years. It's an extraordinary figure, and it's because of industrialization, it's because of capitalist accumulation, and it's huge. And that has to become part of our... We have to know how to theorize this and discuss this, because it is changing the world. It's changing Alberta. I'm teaching Alberta, and suddenly Alison Redford has noticed there's a world outside there. Ooh, how do I get the oil to China? And it's because something real is happening there. I think it's whether it's sub-imperial, how we theorize it, these are big questions, but noticing it is the first step to do. The book as a whole I found is a wonderful corrective to a problem that I think we have had in political economy, which is that it's being too US-centric and too focused on the issue of US power. There's a problem with such views, in my opinion. First, they're wrong, okay? In my opinion. The US domination, I'm not sure the extent to which US was never able to achieve a kind of hegemony, but I think it was always exaggerated. In the book, Radhika goes through why the US empire was never as pervasive as the UK empire. That's interesting. A lot of the evidence for that is about the deterritorialization of the US empire. It had to retreat quickly from the question of territory. That's my first question there. Is that a sign of weakness or is that a sign of strength? Because there's a way in which the deterritorialization of US imperialism was a sign maybe it had found a better way of doing empire than through direct colonization. But that's just a question. But obscured behind the big presence of the United States in the world economy from 1945 on was the fact that there was always inter-imperial rivalry. There was always multiple contestations of power that might have been below the surface and might have been subsumed under common project, but it never actually went away. There's a general issue in terms of political economy that I think that's really important to put on the table. Specifically to the field that I was trained in Canadian political economy, I think is important because Canadian political economy, as it developed with two central theses that were problematic. One was an underplaying of capitalism in Canada, counterposed to an overstatement, so understating capitalist development in Canada, indigenous capitalism, and overstating US dominance and US capitalist development. You can see it in all of the classic books. Go to Carroll, The Silent Surrender, where it projects unending decline for Canadian capitalism and an increasing dominance for US capitalism. We simply haven't seen it. I won't go into the dollar question, but if you go to the issue of if capitalism can be conceived of as a constellation of corporate power no longer in its majority resides in the United States. Europe surpassed it some time ago, and now China, the rise of China and corporations based in China into the top 500 corporations is it's a very new phenomenon. In 2005, it wasn't there. 2013, it's there. And it's something that has to be taken into consideration. And a framework that breaks from a US-centered view actually allows us to see this. Very, very helpful. Some specific nuggets I really like. I hadn't really encountered List and Hamilton until I went to teach development studies at Trent University. And then I found everyone was talking about List and Hamilton. And I said, who are List and Hamilton? I had to figure them out. It's actually really important because the absence of, the presence of List and Hamilton reminds us that the state and capital are always like this. There is a myth that comes from the neoclassical economists that the market is over here and the state's over here. It's capitalism emerges with the state and it will die with the state. The two of them go up and they down together. You can't get one without the other. There's a lovely quote in, it's you quoting somebody else. The more freedom it has to determine its own policies, the faster a developing country will grow. Thank you. This is a very important point to focus on, and I think it answers part of the question that Ingo raised about how do we integrate things like the Chinese Revolution into our understanding of the world economy. Because I think that the background to China's industrial revolution that's happening now is the assertion of sovereignty that China made in 1949 against colonialism. The character of the Chinese Revolution we can put aside for the moment. At the very least, it was an assertion of sovereignty. It was saying, we will develop here now on our own, without you, Japan, without you, United States, without you, Russia, later on. I mean, had to push aside various different imperialist powers. And that assertion of sovereignty, I think, is indispensable in terms of capital accumulation projects, and we need to remind ourselves of that. I think that that underlines for me that if I had to, anyway, the importance of the anti-colonial revolutions and restructuring the world economy and creating conditions for capital accumulation in various different parts of the world. Stop. One question then. Why has the role of the US been exaggerated? I think part of it's in your book where you say, I think it's deeply rooted in what Bill raised, the misunderstanding of US militarism, or underestimating the contradictions of US militarism as a thing that factors in decline. Is it possibly also a misunderstanding of the nature of the Cold War, which is another point that Ingo raised, that the Cold War in fact was inter-imperialist rivalry and not a clash between capitalism and communism as we thought it was. And that if we see this imperialist rivalry, that will change the way in which we see the shape of the world economy in the 20th century. But I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much. And we move on to Hamilton of a different kind, not the American politician, economist, but our expatriate BC friend Steve McBride, who's now in Hamilton.
Yes, I'm not going to waste my 5 minutes on the Hamilton theme, so I'll pick that up later. First of all, let me say, I think books like this are always welcome. And by books like this, I mean broad, historical, theoretical, analytical interpretations, actually, of the entire global political economy. I think, obviously, a book of this nature casts a wide net. It confronts a large number of orthodoxies and takes positions on them, and as a result is likely to attract a fair amount of opposition, either from dyed-in-the-wool supporters of those orthodoxies or from people who think the case against them hasn't been made as convincingly as it might be, or remain unconvinced. The central arguments, I think, are very interesting. The centrality of states, an emerging multipolar world, the depiction of theories like hegemonic stability, globalization, and empire as ideological, really as ideologies masking the failure of the US to establish hegemony. And then, I guess finally, what I think Radhika calls a recovery mission, or maybe these are my words, a recovery mission for the UCD, or the theory of uneven and combined development. Very briefly, in the introduction, she says, as I pulled UCD out of this mire, the mire into which it had fallen at the time, cleaning it up and overhauling it, fitting it with carefully chosen modern trappings, Keynes, Planning, and so forth. Leading on, I guess, to this redefinition of geopolitical economy on that basis. So I think those are all, very powerful parts of the book. The last point, though, takes me on to one of 3 points of discussion. I didn't get your memo about one single point, Ingo. If I did, I didn't read it. So
That's a lack of a demo, right?
I'll put the 3 points on the table, and then if I get cut off, at least they sit there and can be picked up later. The first is one that Bill already mentioned, which is the radical interpretation of Keynes and how plausible that is. The second is, and for those who haven't read the book, there's a chapter in it at the beginning called The Materiality of Nations, or the states perhaps. And I think by depicting globalization merely as an ideology, you deny it a materiality which in fact it may have. And the third thing is a methodological point, part of which you acknowledge, and it's quite understandable. Ironically, there is a US focus in this book. And obviously, I think somewhere you say you plan to augment this later with other investigations. But within the US focus, there's also a concentration on a single data source, which is these economic reports of the presidents, about which I'll say it now, is the argument why that was such a central data source isn't really presented, and it could well be, or at least it gives the impression that were other data sources to be consulted, possibly other conclusions could be reached. At any rate, I think why that choice was made might be something to address. On the other 2 points about the interpretation of Keynesianism, it caused me to go back and reread the concluding chapter of the general theory, where we get all this stuff about the euthanasia of the rentier and the potentially socialization of investment and so forth, all of which is obviously there. And I think we can probably all agree that Keynes was more radical than the kind of bastard Keynesianism that John Robinson and other people criticized. The question I would pose is whether he's as radical, based at least on that chapter, as perhaps you suggest. And even in the quotation in the book you have, where the socialization of investment quotation, that sentence runs on, or this need not exclude all manner of compromise and devices by which public authority will be shared with private authority. Incidentally, for anyone who hasn't looked at that chapter in a while, or has never looked at it, it's a surprisingly modern piece of work. what that passage gives rise to, in my mind, is the P3 phenomenon, which is precisely that. But it isn't a radical version, because it's really the partnership is running the other way, the intrusion of the private sector into the public domain, rather than perhaps public into private. And I think also some of the other passages in there, that there's nothing wrong with the nature of investment except its volume, right? So we should leave the choice of where to invest to the private sector, because the individualist system based on efficiency and self-interest is still good. Anyway, my real point is, it is obviously possible to have a radical reading of Keynes, but it's also possible to have many other readings of Keynes as well. And that if that old adage of Marx is about, ideas only acquire a material force when they're taken up by some, I think it was the masses, but anyway, any social force will do. That radical interpretation, I don't think, was ever taken up by any social force of any significance, and therefore the other one prevailed. The final point on globalization is, and I've just got my stop sign, so I must be quick. I think is obviously globalization did function ideologically in the way that you suggest, but I think to suggest that it came to a sudden stop in 2000 with the stock market crash, or that it had no material existence, well, personally I disagree with it. I mean, I think if you look at the intricate architecture of trade and investment agreements, global, regional and bilateral, the partial enforcement mechanisms built into those are designed to lock in, and I would think lock in globalization, and to some extent do so, I would argue, successfully. But in any event, we have a chair and I bow down to him and stuff.
We'll have chances to continue, but we really want to have a discussion. And we want to have our next speaker, the last one before the author takes over.
5 minutes, okay.
Yes.
I tried to be environmentally friendly, that's why I didn't print my paper, so I'm going to read from here. Obviously. Okay, so I come from a Polarización state theoretical perspective, a Marxist theory of the state. So I highly appreciate 3 moments Radhika brought in her argument. The first one is the insistence on the centrality of the nation state in the making of capital in all its history. So there's no such a thing as class relation, capital, labor, etc. without the state. This is very important, essential for the production of capitalist relation on a worldwide scale. The second moment, the ever historically specific power constellation on a worldwide scale, the displacement and the reconfiguration of relational forces due to imitation, catch-up, other strategies of jumping over specific stages of development and so on. And the third moment is the almost the impossibility of one specific state to take a central stage in the development of capital on a worldwide scale for a specific period of time. If anything, it is due to a specific constellation of power, just a temporary, but not a permanent status which one state can acquire and so on. And the third moment, which is and I think this is maybe, as Ingo was saying, the difference between Leo's, Sam's, and Radhika's perspective. Taking multipolarity seriously in the current constellation. And in this sense, it's a bit difficult to estimate what does this mean on the middle and long-term development, not only the US dollar on the currency level, but on other political, economic level, etc. And in this instance, I argue that the argument can be sharpened into a hypothesis whose rationalities can only be inferred by future development. So it's very difficult to say how things would develop from now on. And because I take 2 moments seriously, and I did this also in one of my essays last year, to say that the fact that there was such a thing as ultra-imperialist constellation of power in Western Europe and the United States during the Cold War, it was precisely due to the Cold War and the presence of the Soviet Union. So they were conditions of existence why these imperialist power came together to build this bloc and so on. Having this ultra-imperialist, to take Tarkovsky's term, though Tarkovsky made it all a different way, but anyway, having this ultra-imperialist constellation in the past doesn't mean that we can project into the future. It doesn't exclude the intra-imperialist conflict and rivalries in the future. So I think this is a very important moment to take into consideration, not to do the mistake, project like past development into the future, and then anticipate and predict any development on worldwide scale as confirmation for the US empire or against the US empire. So I think this is a very important movement. So in this sense, the so-called US hegemony is contested, or the demise or the decline of US hegemony, which Radhika takes from the outset as a mirage. It was never actually hegemony. I think that this question, beyond this speculative character of it, refers to a different problematic at a different level. So when I put Leo's and Sam's argument in the making of global capitalism and the center stage of the US, American states and capital in the making, especially after the Second World War, if I take that argument seriously, and I'm taking it very seriously, and put it with Radhika in a way, try to synthesize both, and the way they argue that the capacity of the United States and US capital to identify its particular interest with the general interest of capital on a worldwide scale, which I think is very difficult because it's difficult to estimate what is the general interest of capital on a worldwide scale. But again, to take both arguments and put them together, I have a synthesis. Stop? Do I stop? Okay. So let me just bring my hypothesis in this sense, putting two arguments together in the spirit of Nikos Poulantzas. Maybe the tragic of the US state and capital, not so much its capacity, will, etc., to dominate the world capitalism, or whatever you call it, but to take Poulantzas seriously. Just like the United States penetrate other states and capital, and these states and capitals interiorize this US ideological, political, economic mood within their state societies, the other way around is also correct. That China, India, Brazil, Russia, and Western Europe also penetrate US capitalist states and are interiorized within the US state apparatus. So in a way, in other words, to say that the tragic of the US state and capital, not so much to determine the worldwide scale or to identify their interest with the general interest of capital, but the interest of the ruling classes in other states outside the United States affect the form of the US state and its capital, affected from within. And thus, in a way, if it declined, it's because of this constellation of forces on a worldwide scale. Maybe two things, just question. Coming from, as I said, a state theoretical perspective, Nikos Poulantzas, what I missed in the book is, although Radhika was doing like some references to it, a under-theorization of class struggle, especially if you take the nation states and the making of capital. So the major contradiction is the class struggle within the nation state, because it determines policies, ideas, etc. And the second moment, of course, also a theory of the state. Radhika spent a lot of time talking about state, international relation, ideas, influences, but not really a theorization of the state and its essential role in the making of capital. Am I okay? Good.
Thanks, Sabah. Thanks, everybody else. So, Radhika, did you survive?
Yes, how much time do I have?
5 minutes.
Oh my God! She should have 20.
I think I should have 20, exactly. But
I understand you're thinking about your next
I mean,
book.
obviously, I'm not going to respond to all of the points, but all the four speakers have raised, I think, extremely important points, and I think it gives me an opportunity to explain further, in a sense, what I'm doing here, and they're all very good questions, and I really welcome, first of all, I just want to say thank you for the engagement, which I really appreciate. Now, I think that maybe I would like to begin with a remark that, I mean, I'm not going to take them in the order in which they were raised, but try and put some coherence to it. And I'd like to maybe begin, perhaps, by taking a point that Sabah made at the very end, when you said, Sabah, that it's very difficult to estimate the general interest of capital on a world scale. And I think that this is a very key point, and it ties in with a very fundamental thing I said, which nobody here picked up. But I think that I take that to mean agreement, which is very good. And that is that I argue that it is very common, particularly once globalization discourse got going, to take Marx as a sort of or original theorist of globalization, as though he subscribed to a sort of, the world economy is a single unified whole, states don't matter, etc. type rhetoric. In reality, if you read Marx, and obviously Marx did not write the volume on, the world trade, etc., that he intended to, but I show that even if you read what he did write, that Marx took not only Marx took the national, that is to say, the nation state as being central. In fact, I show that he considered nation states to be as material a product of the development of capitalism as he did class. That is to say that class and nation are equally important in trying to understand capitalism as a world scale. So I completely agree with you that class is important, but so is the nation state. So Marx is not some kind of supporter of free trade, as a casual reading of some of his 1844 writings might suggest. And I base my overhauling of uneven and combined development that I undertake on this reading. And I point out that Marx also, he has this wonderful expression in the short little note on Carroll, that there are contradictions within capitalism, between competing capitals within a given domestic economy, but when you look at the world economy as a whole, those contradictions gain their full play as the contradictions of the relations between producing nations, as the competition between nationally organized blocks of capital. So I think this is very, very important, and I just want to underline that. And so, in a sense, and this sort of then will help me, having laid this down, help me answer some of the other questions. But let me also now take up the matter of Keynes, which I also think is very, at least of the educated bourgeoisie, so to speak, the sort of, and in that sense, I mean, he even stated very plainly, as Robert Skidelsky points out in his multi-volume biography, that he saw himself as a member of the bourgeois class, etc. Fine. However, and this is a new paper I'm developing precisely on the issue of, post-dollar world and Keynes's ideas for international currency and so on. And in this, I delve much more into Keynes, and basically, in a sense, I'm sort of further concretizing the image I have of Keynes. Keynes is the leading intellectual of the one economy in the world that is going in his own lifetime from being the ruler of the world, effectively, to becoming an ordinary nation state. And he is basically, he never made any bones about it. He is speaking of in terms of the interests of the British economy. And I record meticulously all the times, for example, in which he, for example, made all sorts of policy pronouncements which were against the interests of India and for the interests of the UK, trying to preserve as much of its power, prestige as possible. But it is the conclusions he is driven to that are important. It is capitalism that is forcing him to these conclusions if he has the interest of the British economy at heart. And I think that in this sense, radicalism is not something that, Keynes says, he's going to go and fight in front of the, barricades and so on. No, he's not doing anything of the sort. In fact, Keynes's radicalism is in that sense far more, well, as I say, it's not as great as Marx's, but it is very interesting in one respect. I'm not even saying it's more interesting than Marx, because I think Marx's radicalism is powerful and very interesting, and I think sui generis almost. But Keynes's radicalism is of this particular sort, that these are conclusions that he must come to. And by the way, I should make one other point. The argument about the radicalism of Keynes did not start out as a radical, but he became radical when he realized that the economy cannot function without trying to create full employment. And his commitment to full employment is, to me, very, very important, because you see, we say, Keynes was not so radical, Kaletsky was, he saw the political contradictions of full employment, but I don't think that Keynes was that dumb. He could see that, but he still said, in fact, he said he wants to run a full employment economy in which capitalists simply... Yes, okay. So okay, I'll leave that there. Forget about Keynes. I mean, Keynes is very interesting, and I'll be writing other stuff about him. But let's get down to the more nitty-gritty. So, Ingo pointed out that the Cold War is missing. I'd just like to respond very briefly by saying that yes, the conventional discourse of Cold War is more or less absent in my book, because I think that the conventional discourse on the Cold War was systematically about misunderstanding what it was. Because to me, the Cold War was about uneven and combined development. The Soviet Union in its time represented the most powerful form of combined development. And I think that in this form, it actually enabled and made possible other forms of combined development. One thing it is easy to forget today is that, okay, the era of development in the 50s and 60s was disappointing in many, many ways. But it was even then sufficiently successful to pose a threat to the existing distribution of economic power in the world by the 1970s, and the demand for the new international economic order, etc., were taken as extremely threatening. And these developments would not have happened if the Soviet, well, they would have taken a very different way. Let me put it another way. In these developments, the Soviet Union played a very, very big role, because in a sense, it encouraged forms of national development in various third world countries, and also, very importantly, it allowed Europeans, Western Europe, to have a much more state interventionist form of development, because the Americans had to accept that, okay, if we cannot, I mean, these guys had to be sufficiently strengthened, even if it meant state interventionist forms of capitalism. One of my interlocutors, Gary Dimsky, actually saw something which I thought nobody else did see, which is my reliance on Fred Bloch. He was one of those earliest writers who pointed out that the United States Cold War is as much against the Soviet Union as it is against forms of national development. So any type of development in other countries which did not conform to the requirements of the US was problematic. So that's the Cold War. And I think everyone, you'll forgive me if please come back with any question if you think it's sufficiently important and I haven't responded, because I want to respond to all of them. But in Bill's case, I will take 2 points that he made which are very important. US dollar hegemony, and you pointed out that for me it is always tenuous, and of course I show that it is always tenuous. And what I also show is that quite frankly, even the so-called heyday of US dollar hegemony, you don't have anything of the sort. What you have is, in the 1950s, extremely limited international liquidity provision, which everybody complains about and so on, simply because, and here's where the difference between the UK and the US comes in. Without formal colonies, the US is simply unable to export capital. And every other way of providing international liquidity is simply, it's just very problematic, and it's not sustainable. So in the 1950s, the US is unable to provide the liquidity. Everybody complains of a dollar shortage. The minute other countries' currencies, powerful countries' currencies become convertible, the dollar shortage turns overnight into a dollar glut. Triffin writes his Triffin Dilemma works and so on, testifies before Congress, blah, blah, etc. So all of this is out there from the beginning. And of course, it still takes another 12, 13 years before the formal closing of the gold window, but already before then, gold is drained out of the US, although I think these days it's becoming quite clear that there are interesting questions about where all this gold is gone, but we will talk about that later. So that there's that. And then my argument is, after that point, the only way in which the United States dollar can continue to have the liquidity backing that is necessary for it to be a reserve asset is through the series of financializations that the US powers. And I think that this is what basically then becomes the substance of several chapters. And so then the last two financializations were the stock market bubble under Greenspan's encouragement that, we are having we have a new economy, and this, the stock market growth is, rise is completely justified, etc., all of which is complete rubbish. And then you have, and the dollar did rise, at that point. And then, of course, after 2000, okay, the US economy is not exactly, people say 2000 recession was not so bad, etc. But actually, it began a long decade during which US growth remained anemic at best, despite low interest rates, the creation of the next bubble, the housing bubble, etc., etc. So you actually have all of these problems. And so to me, dollar hegemony has, of course, it has also not been good for the US working class, but the rest of the world is beginning to recognize the problems. You get the first movement on the part of other countries trying to insulate themselves from these problems of the dollar right after the East Asian economic crisis. This begins the move towards having these bilateral arrangements, currency swaps, reserve pooling, etc. And also trade agreements in which two countries decide, okay, we will simply leave the dollar out, we will trade with each other's money. And by the way, what is the euro? Okay, it's not very successful right now, but what was the euro? The euro was the first such attempt to simply get the dollar out of the situation. I will say one other thing. Part of the reason, in addition to these agreements that I refer to in my book as well, part of the reason I think that this is the end, basically, of the dollar's use. It will linger, but there will be lots of other instruments aiding international trade, etc. The international capital flows, precisely those transactions that gave the dollar the kind of international liquidity it needed, have collapsed since 2008. They have since recovered, according to a McKinsey, what's that outfit called? McKinsey, anyway, research, it's a research outfit, not exactly very revolutionary, shall we say, but they record very meticulously and punctiliously that these, and all, not only have they fallen in aggregate, but all the different bits that have changed, but they have fallen and they did recover, but today they are only 40% of their previous peak, and they will continue. There is no real prospect of growth, because today growth is taking place in countries that are not nearly as financialized as the US and the UK. The term financialization is very problematic from that point of view, because we use it as though, sure, every country is experiencing some amount of financialization, but we forget that financialization does not just have a history, it has a geography. There was some parts of the world, financialization to me as an aggregate phenomena was uniquely dollar-centered and US-centered. And we must take this into account if we are to understand. Of course, Europe was a very important late, how can you say, entrant into this party, and they are suffering for it today. But it is very interesting that the developing, the emerging economies, the BRICS, etc., did not suffer as much because they did not buy into it as much. Once bitten, twice shy. They suffered in the 1997 East Asian economic crisis, and they were not going to get into this again. Yes, China has to hold reserve assets, but China is also in the forefront of those who are saying we need to replace this with something else. So,
can we?
Okay, unfortunately, but I will try and bring in these points in the other Q&A.
There's lots of stuff on the table, quite obviously. I encourage everybody who is teaching to have classes on these things. Obviously, there are lots of open questions. I hope we can keep this momentum. And to do so, I think it's important that the spark now causes a prairie fire among the ranks of the participants, who I'm sure also have opinions, questions, so please feel free to address any of the issues that were raised, and then we kind of go back and forth, and I will have speakers. Let's collect a few, and then we see who is responding from the panel. Who wants to go first? I stopped these people so you can speak.
I'll go. I wasn't planning on going first, but since no one else raised their hand. And I'm speaking from a disadvantage because I haven't had the opportunity to read the book. I have read some of your articles. and picking up on some of the themes that were raised. So one thing that I wonder, and I'm by no means the only person who's wondered this, but I'll just raise it for the panel. Insofar as the BRICS play a factor in the analysis and the discussion that was just had, I guess my question is, how useful is the actual category of the BRICS? Putting aside for a moment, not putting aside, because I think, so how useful is it insofar as we're talking about quite very different countries, both in the size, both in their global influence in terms of political and economic influence. Brazil its influence is much more regional. There's an interesting article recently, I think it was in a special issue of New Political Economy on the issue of the BRICS. Like, how extensive can you say Brazil's reach beyond South America? In fact, the role that it's played in terms of its militarization within South America, in Haiti under the auspices of a coup that was led by the United States and France, and picking up a role under that auspices in terms of subordinating that particular country, not independent militarily of the United States in that particular context. Its export platform is much, much different in terms of, say, China's. Right? It's still very natural resource dependency in terms of its exports and so on. So, and growth rates are quite different amongst all the countries. So how useful is it really to talk about the BRICS as a category, and as a category that is potentially challenging US hegemony? And the last question I guess I would raise is how, and again, this could be for anyone who wants to speak to it, is there another country at present or in the near future that has the depth and breadth in its financial architecture that could replace American financial architecture, and thus the role that the dollar plays at a global level? I don't think there is at this point, but I'm happy to hear what you have to say about that.
Thanks very much. Who wants to go next?
Two simple questions. How many years do you think will it need that the Chinese currency will be the leading currency of the world?
That was straightforward. The answer will be more difficult. Who else?
I'm happy to answer these two questions. Should I?
It's not so much a question as an observation, but it leads to a question, and it concerns this issue of the radicality of Keynes. Because as a recent arrival in North America, I'm always astonished by the term Eurocentrism, because it strikes me that nowadays what's called Eurocentrism is nothing really other than US centrism. and it's important to understand this, because it gives rise to all kinds of conceptions, and one of which is this notion that Keynes is not a scientifically a radical because he's not politically a radical. And this goes hand in glove with what I call the mistaking of audacity for capacity. That there is a sense in which the US is hegemonic. It's hegemonic ideologically. So that the success, the ideological success of the USA is the astonishing facility with which otherwise scholarly and intelligent people reproduce stories that are generated by the State Department as if they were rock-solid economic knowledge. Now, how does that link up with Keynes's radicalism? Because an extraordinary perspicacity of Keynes is precisely because he wanted to save capitalism. He knew how much it would take. He did not underestimate how difficult it was. And in particular, as Radhika explains very clearly, he understood that Bretton Woods would not work. That is, he understood you could not actually have a single world currency, which I think is an extraordinarily radical conclusion. And what I find strange about those who almost give in to the audacity of the USA and accept it as capacity is this notion that somehow it's a practical project, that Bretton Woods can work, that you can have a world. No, you can't, not under capitalism. And Keynes, one of the greatest supporters of capitalism, understood that. So you have a position where the supporters of empire and globalization and the ultimate strength and bastion of civilization that the USA is, people who subscribe to that, are to the right of Keynes, because they believe it is possible to have a world currency based on a single capitalist nation. Now I think, and I suspect, and it's one of the things I want to study, that failure of scientific radicalism, the failure to be as scientifically radical as Keynes, does lead to a series of political non-radicalisms. One of which is that every time that somebody takes a step that challenges the USA, even a small one, it's taken to be an imitation. And all this discussion about sub-imperialism, to me, is just a nonsense. Imperialism is a historical stage in capitalism. It's over. I don't mean that the imperialist system, the system of oppressed and oppressor nations, is over. That's as strong as ever. But the mode in which it's conducted, and a new power is not going to come up and become another imperialist. It's going to become a new historical reality, and that's important to study. But don't think it's just an imitation of what has gone before. It isn't. And the consequence of that, I remember so passionately at the early days of Chavez, how difficult it was to convince Western liberals or leftists that this guy was actually doing something really historically radically different. Because they would turn around to me and say, well, he's not a socialist. Well, I mean, actually he was more socialist than any of them. But even if he had not been socialist, you know, the radicalism of small challenges to a collapsing power and the capacity to unleash revolutionary processes of simply demonstrating that a small resistance brings big results is never to be underestimated. So I really think this sort of lack of scientific radicalism in the US intelligentsia, and far be it to me decrying my new country, Canada, so I don't know to what extent this is reproduced in the Canadian intelligentsia, but I would say it's less than in the USA, leads to a political rightism. And I think that that's one of the things we have to sort of begin to try and understand how that works. I don't have the full answer to it, but I do think we have to understand how that works. And I'd love if I could explore it.
Let me add one thing on geography on this to give kind of structure. Because it strikes to me that in your book, Radhika, there's an underlying subtext of UK decay continue. And in the same, which reproduces kind of the common sense, or maybe in Britain and the Commonwealth. And in Leo's and Sam's book, it to some degree reproduces the idea the US is always the innovating and forward marching country, and from continental Europe, I find that quite interesting. And sticking out of global political economy due to German history, I wonder what a French radical would have to say about this. Might be a very different perspective. And picking up Paul's intervention, even more so somebody from China. So I think it's really important to take into consideration what we learned, what we grew up with when we engage in analysis and put things into perspective. Now, there's one, and then I give it back to the panel.
The question is not so much about the content of the book. Obviously, I haven't read, but I'm more interested in, because I know you traveled quite a bit, and presumably also, talked about in your book. Just, so your title is Geopolitical Economy after U.S. hegemony. I'm just curious to hear more about how your book was received in different places. Because, we're here sitting in Canada or, go to the United States and talk about this. And my feeling that it will be very differently received in, BRICS. And that might also actually, I think this kind of dialogues are kind of missing because we sort of self-referential. In Canada we talk about this and that, but you talk about China and we don't know what the Chinese actually, I know, but a lot of people don't really know what the Chinese, think about. You're writing about China, so.
Thank you very much. Now, I would suggest we go through again, and shall we do the reverse order? It would end up with you again, Radhika. Is that fine with you?
Yeah.
To go first?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hold the term BRICS for important for maybe one reason. Again, to go back to Polanyi, what he in the 1970s, what he termed the induced reproduction, how imperialist structure are reproduced within the periphery or semi-periphery social formation not only economically, but also ideologically, affecting the state apparatus and the ruling classes, how they think about development, etc., etc. And to avoid this term sub-imperialist, as I said last year, I tried in my paper to introduce the term lower order imperialism. These are imperialist power at the lower level, but with a difference to the sub-imperialists. You know, sub-imperialists were mostly, if we think about South Africa under the apartheid regime, Israel or Iran under the Shah, they were puppet for Western Europe and the United States. Whereas these new lower order imperialists like Brazil, South Africa, China, India, they take some moment of the popular classes seriously, nationalist moment seriously, to articulate their own lower order imperialist project. So if we look at Brazil, and I was astonished when I was talking to some Brazilian colleagues, how Brazilian people think of their own Brazil and its global role as something so important and something so national in the interest of all Brazilians and so on. So in this way, they incorporate some popular moment, national moment, or what I have termed neo-national movement in their overall imperialist project. In this sense, they develop a relation of conflict and cooperation with imperialist power, rather than being just a puppet of this power. What does this mean? Of course, it opens up a new contradiction and conflict, domestically on a worldwide scale. So in this sense, yes, BRICS is a lower order imperialist bloc. That's why I think it's important. The other thing, and just to take the last two comments here, I think also, Radhika, in your book, you mostly refer to Anglo-Saxon North American literature on this topic of imperialism. But continental European contribution, Marxist contribution, are mostly absent. There was more references there. And what also so-called peripheral Marxists, Latin America and Africa and Asia, the knowledge they produced about capital development, imperialism, and US empire, etc., are also not really reflected in your reading. I think, of course, you were saying this at the beginning, the focus will be here, but I think if we include these literature, we will have a bit different picture altogether. Yeah.
Steve? Well, obviously, Radhika, with some support from the floor, launched a passionate defense of Keynes's radicalism. I mean, I think it's important not to view this radicalism of Keynes or in either-or terms. I mean, obviously, in the context of his time or in the context of today, what Keynes had to say, especially about full employment, is a radical alteration of capitalism. But I think, and of course, you know, like any human being or thinker, Keynes comes to an end, and what he would have said subsequent to the in subsequent years, it must remain unknown. But I certainly think if we take that concluding chapter of the general theory as a reasonable statement of his radicalism, and the limits to his radicalism as well, part of the case for full employment, there are passages in there which suggest he believed that under conditions of full employment, neoclassical economics would work just fine. Yeah, so I mean, that isn't a particularly radical conclusion, although in the context of the Great Depression, to push for full employment today would be. So I think that's all I would say. I thought Radhika's defense of Keynes here today was much more impressive than the one in the book, by the way. But
I can only say so much.
But I do think in looking at Keynes, if we're to take Alan's injunction about being scientific about that, to look at Keynes scientifically, we need to look at the limits as well as the possibilities as well.
Well, 2 points then, one on the BRICS, one on Keynes. In terms of the BRICS, I think, is it an appropriate term? Well, I wrote down to myself, it's an imperfect fetishized term which nonetheless captures something real. Okay, so it's an imperfect term, absolutely, but there is something real going on that we need to pay attention to. And I started making the list: China, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, Turkey, Iran, Nigeria, Brazil. This is big. This is huge. This is the phenomenon of our time right now. And it's how we understand it will be a subject of discussion over the years. In understanding it, I want to come to something we haven't mentioned yet, is the very title of the book, Geopolitical Economy. The more I play around with it, the more I like it. Because political economy insists on the relationship between economics and the state. Geopolitical economy says that that's state, economy, and states, you know, combining and clashing and organizing with each other, and actually we need all of those components in terms of how we're going to understand this world as it unfolds in the 21st century. In terms of Keynes, what an interesting discussion. The part I will focus on is the question of currency and the world currency and special drawing rights, Keynes. He at least poses the question. Now, that question is now being reposed in a fetishized way in the 21st century through this peculiar thing that's going on called quantitative easing, which you get to in the other book. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, they've come to the limits of world money based on one state, and to try to deal with those limits, that they're doing this quantitative easing thing that will not, in the long run, work. But I mean, they're doing what they can with it. At least they're dealing with it. And in this discussion, number one, the European Union might be in crisis right now, but the euro is not gone. And Europe has not disappeared as a central pillar of the world capitalist economy. It's restructuring. It's a big, painful, horrifying restructuring. But number two, that means too that the question of world money will now be posed in a big way, and it won't be the U.S. dollar. It will not be. It cannot be. I don't know what the answer will be. I don't know how it will be figured out. But at least Keynes is one of the writers in the 20th century who asked the question. He says, "Yeah, what are we going to do? How are we going to manage this thing? Special drawing rights. Let's try this thing." Didn't work. U.S. said, no. We've got the great opportunity of a lifetime. We're going to have our currency be world money, which was lovely for a while, and now they're paying the price for it. So I'll leave it at that. Love the book. Had a great time reading it, and thanks for writing it.
Okay, well, I'll just, briefly about Keynes. I think there's certainly a sense in which Keynes can be mobilized for radical political projects, and in a context of endemic neoliberalism, one can point to the social rationality, the need for full employment, the need to reduce economic inequalities, and so on, and the problems of unevenness of capital accumulation. But I think, in a sense, the logic of his approach leads not in a democratic direction, but in a technocratic direction. I would say that's my major knock on Keynes in terms of how radical, what the limits of his radicalism are in that sense. If we think of, and part of what we're thinking about as a possible future is some kind of radical democratic socialism, participatory democracy, and so on. It's not that easy to square that kind of project with a full-blooded Keynesian project of technocratic management. And I don't think he points necessarily, as Steve was suggesting, to the actual socialization of investment, and certainly to the whole question of democratic control. So that's one point. And then the other thing, to pick up on a point that Steve raised as well, the question of globalization. That's it's in the title of the book, and it's obviously very important. Radhika's reading is very much about globalization as ideology that sort of was ascendant in the Clinton years especially, and for various reasons it falls into decline and is replaced with the kind of ideology of empire and practice of empire and imperial overreach by Bush and so on and so forth. And that's really interesting reading, I think. But I wonder, if we look at some of these international institutions, WTO kinds of institutions, if we talk about the materiality of the state in terms of nation states, I mean, these are also material. These have a material reality, and so they're definitely more than just ideology, if I can use that kind of distinction. So, at that point, the question is there nothing to the thesis of globalization, capitalist globalization?
Okay. I think I will start there because it's one of the very important questions that I didn't have a chance to get to earlier, so I will take this up because this is a very important question. Originally, this book was just going to be a critique of the globalization ideology, and then I realized that actually, in order to do that, I needed to criticize hegemony, stability theory, and notions of US hegemony as well. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about globalization in particular. So my view is that, okay, so let me tell you this point, make this point in the following way. There are people who thought globalization was wonderful. There were people who thought globalization was an unmitigated disaster. There are people who thought that whether you liked it or not, globalization was real. Now at that point, a bunch of skeptics come around. Paul Hurst, Hurston Thompson, Linda Weiss, and all these people. And they show so definitively that these claims about globalization are wrong. That the world has been more global, if one's going to view these things, before 1914, etc. They force such a retreat on those who wish to talk about globalization. Then along comes David Held. He talks about transformationalism, which basically means having your cake and eating it too. It's not this, it's not a little bit of that, a little bit of this. Quite frankly, if you read David Held enough, I would not be at all surprised if somebody who took him seriously ended up in a mental asylum. I'm not joking. It is impossible to take him seriously. So my point here then is that, because if you really try, all right, how does it all add up? It will drive you batty. Okay, so then my point is, I come along and I say, the skeptics are right, there is no such thing as globalization. But then, why did we suddenly start talking about globalization in the 1990s? That is the question to which Chapter 7 on globalization is the answer. And my point is, I call my account an ironic account of globalization. It's not real, but it's real, in a different sense. And I think that it, to me, now, having said that, of course, capital has international activities and these are increasing, and I have no problem with that. There is no issue with that. But it is international, in a type of world economy in which states are playing larger and larger roles, and in which the logic of uneven and combined development and the competition between states and the dialectic of attempts the imposition of imperial power wherever possible and the resistance to it, these are all the key drivers. And I think this is what we have to pay attention to, not these silly theories which encourage us to assume that the world, the other way I put it is that all these, I call them, and I want to come back to a point that Paul made once and it has come up again. Why were these theories believed? So one broad point I make in my book is that basically, if you ask what time is it in the history of imperialism, then my book, the answer that my book gives is that it is the end of a long period in the history of imperialism when world domination by a single power was either real or attempted. And today we are now in a different mode where this cannot even be seriously attempted. And if I have time, I want to come back to your military question as well. But the point is that I just don't think it can be attempted. That is why. So that's where we are at right now in terms of the history of imperialism. And in this phase, when the UK was dominant with its free trade ideology, and then the United States tried to be dominant through these series of events that are described, through various discourses of hegemony, stability theory, globalization, empire, etc. These are cosmopolitan discourses that encourage us to think of the world economy as a seamless whole, okay? In which either no state matters, globalization or free trade, or only one state matters, hegemony, stability theory, empire, which means that the vast majority of other states play no role in determining the future. They are inconsequential. That is not true. If that were true, we wouldn't be talking about BRICS or multipolarity. I mean, I agree. I should say that I have two short pieces which you may be interested in. One is on a website called BRICS Post, and it's called BRICS without mortar ? And the other is, if you just go to the Guardian commentary stream that I wrote. The first was written before the recent BRICS summit, and the second was written after. And they're a nice little pair which precisely address this question. And I basically think that BRICS is, of course, an artificial term, but the operations of imperialism today and in the last several decades are giving them a greater reality than it would otherwise have. That's my short answer to your point. So the point is that my point about why is this discourse believed? I think that somebody made a couple of different people. Fang asked the question, how is my stuff received? And Sabah pointed out that I don't talk about the peripheral discourses, etc., and even European ones. But of course, you're right. and I actually have a little paragraph in my introduction where I say that actually this is, for a book that is critiquing the notion of US hegemony, this book is embarrassingly US focused. But you have to start there. And I do have a larger project. In fact, I'll be talking to some of you about it. And it is to basically found geopolitical economy precisely for some of the reasons that Paul says, as a framework for understanding the evolution of the world economy. But we can talk about that another time. I mean, first announcement of this. Public. I'm thinking of actually setting up an institute for geopolitical economy, which will play a central role in reforming our conceptions. But to come back to this point, my point is, look, even if you confine yourself to American and a few European writers, you can show that American hegemony is problematic. Then, if you include the discourses more comprehensively, the European discourses or peripheral discourses, the picture will simply become fuller. That's my point. I mean, even if you, as I said, so this is part of the response. I should say that I do agree with Bill very much that Keynes was not exactly a radical democrat, shall we say. I think he was definitely more technocratic, and I think that my point is simply that his analysis is very radical. That he could see what capitalism could and couldn't do, and that if therefore, at that point, if human society were to survive, then something much more deliberate. The state would have to do something, and of course for you and me, if it is anything other than a very democratic state, that's a very big problem. And I completely agree with you. I wouldn't quibble about it. I should say that I have written several things on Keynes, which you will find on my academia.edu page, which also, I mean, Steve was making fun that, I defended Keynes better now than I did in the book, but the fact is, in the book, I have only so much space. Some people also raised the issue of the dollar. I think the person at the back pointed out, and there was a question of renminbi, etc. I think it is an illusion of hegemony stability theory, an illusion created by hegemony stability theory precisely in order to make US aspirations look natural when in fact they were completely unnatural. That the currency of any single country that is not capable of vast capital exports can be the currency of the world. It's not possible. Keynes saw this, as Alan pointed out, and that is why he raised, in fact, in Keynes's world, and you asked whether there was any a country with the financial depth. This issue of financial depth, look at where US financial depth has got us today. It is precisely Keynes's point in designing his scheme for an international clearing union and bank corps that in fact there should be as little liquidity required as possible. Why? Because if trade balances overall, you only need money if there is an outstanding balance. And the whole point of the thing was to basically create a situation in which international imbalances were small and temporary. And that was the idea of creditor adjustment. So for example, if Germany is exporting too much to Greece, which is creating this problem, the adjustment would, which unfortunately is happening right now, he points out the adjustment is only imposed on Greece, it will create deflation, which is what it's doing right now. Adjustment also must be imposed on the creditor. That is to say, the creditor, instead of exporting so much, should expand its own economy, consume more of what it's producing, and also consume more of what the importer is producing. So there should be balanced trade. And if you have balanced trade, at the end of the day, how much money do you need? Right? That was Keynes's scheme. And of course it would have to be adapted to the needs of a modern economy. Maybe we would have greater tolerance for imbalances, etc. But the bank corps was precisely something that did not rely on the financial depth of any country, precisely because this was the other hobby horse of Keynes. A financialized economy is exactly the thing to avoid. It is, so this would be, it would create a world of productive national economies which are managing their trade with each other. Managed trade is very important, and by the way, managed trade can lead to more trade than free trade, because free trade is deflationary. And if you have productive and growing economies, you can have managed trade, which actually leads to more volume of trade. And why not? I'm not against trade. I'm only against the kind of trade that devastates economies. which it has done. So you also, and this devastation over, especially over the decades of neoliberalism, which was the price the third world, many parts of the third world had to pay in order to, in fact, also pay for their advocacy of the new international economic order, and so on. You see, this also was applied differentially, because some states couldn't resist. They had to simply accept these dicta, and they were the ones who suffered the most, these neoliberal dicta. Other states were more capable of resisting, and in one and all of these BRIC countries, they were all the most successful of the developing economies today are precisely those who were more capable of resisting the neoliberal recipe. So I gave the example the other day in a talk. India is actually more, the elites of India are kind of more in love with neoliberalism than most other parts of the world, but even in India, the most right-wing government we have had to date, that India has had to date, the one that the BJP-led the National Democratic Alliance government, right-wing Hindu nationalism, close links with fascists, you couldn't get worse than that. This is a very neoliberal government, and even that government not only did not privatize India's huge public sector enterprises, which are up to their elbows in engineering, petrochemicals, fertilizers, you name it, telecom, what have you. Not only did they not privatize them, they called them Bharat Ratna. These are the jewels of India. These are our national, these are legacy corporations. We are not going to, and they are important that they remain in state ownership. So these were the countries that, after a couple of decades of doom, gloom, neoliberalism, these were the ones that started emerging as the fast growers. Because of the past developmentalism of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then the very modified neoliberalism that they accepted, even whether they should have accepted that is a separate question, and so on. And so, on the Chinese renminbi, I will simply say the following. I think that there are a lot of people who talk about internationalizing of renminbi, and in the Western press in particular, that's all we hear about, whether it's possible or not, etc. In reality, I would say there's a struggle going on in China as to whether it should be internationalized. If you have a governor of your central bank who is saying that we need to have an international currency which is no one's currency, then you basically have the presence in your policy-making elite, at least of a small group of people, who are aware of the dangers of this. The Chinese Communist Party is not, it is performing an extremely delicate high-wire act. It can continue to succeed, but there is no guarantee that it will succeed. And the sorts of economic problems that will come with that are basically going to undermine rather than increase legitimacy. In fact, everything so far, at least. I mean, by the way, one of my points about BRICS is nothing guarantees their continued growth. And so internationalizing the renminbi would actually add a major factor that will undermine Chinese growth. And I think the Chinese government is aware of that. Doesn't guarantee the success of that faction, but it's aware of it.